Alright, this last bit we're going to do in this unit is actually something I normally teach later in the year, and we will go over it again later in the year. It's called completing the square. And we're going to go back and use this with the square root method that we learned, a couple lessons ago. But first I want to talk about what a perfect square polynomial is. And so to do that, we're going to go and we're going to expand these binomials. A binomial has two terms, which you can see here. This has one term, two terms. Alright, so that's squared, so what that means is I have x plus 3 times x plus 3. Now I'm going to do a double distribution. That means I'm going to multiply those together. Some of you use FOIL, that's fine too. But I take x and I multiply it by each of the terms in the second set of parentheses. So the first one is x times x will give me x squared. Then x times 3 is going to give me plus 3x. And then the last one, I'm going to take the 3 and multiply it by each of the second terms in the second set of the parentheses. So I'll have plus 3x again and plus 9. Now notice these middle terms are the same. And when I add them together, I get x squared plus 6x plus 9. And that is expanding that binomial. Okay, now I'm going to look at x minus 5 squared. So we're going to have x minus 5 times x minus 5. Multiply the first term out, and so you have x squared minus 5x. And then multiply the second term out, and you have minus 5x plus 25. Again, the middle terms are identical, so they're basically doubled, if you want to think about that. So you have x squared minus 10x plus 25. Okay. So then we're going to go to factoring, which is what we've actually been doing in this unit, is factoring. And so when we factor these binomials, what we have is we can factor it mentally because the first term is an x. And we know that both of them are going to be plus because there's two plus signs there. So we need two numbers that multiply to be 64 and add to be 16. Well, that would be 8 and 8. So those factors are exactly the same. They look identical. Okay. So what that means is I could rewrite this if I wanted to, factored as x plus 8, all of that squared, because that means x plus 8 times x plus 8. Okay. So let's look at the next one. We have x. We have x. We have minus and minus because the last term is positive. That tells me their signs are the same. The first term is negative. That tells me they're both negative. So two numbers that multiply to be 36 and add to be 12 would be 6 and 6. So that's going to actually multiply to be x minus 6 squared. Okay, or factor to be x minus 6 squared. Now, I want you to notice what's happening here. If you have x squared plus bx plus c, that means that the a is 1. There's always a 1 there. In terms of b, so in other words, b in the number 3 problem is 16. And c is 64. Okay. And in our second problem, B is negative 12 and C is 36. I want you to notice that if I took B and divided it by 2 and then squared it, I would end up with C. So let's try that. If I take, over here on the left, if I take 16 and divide it by 2 and then square it, I end up with 64. 16 divided by 2 is 8. 8 times 8 is 64. And that makes sense because, remember, the middle term was doubled. Okay, let's look here. If I have negative 12 divided by 2 and then I square it, I end up with positive 36. Negative 12 divided by 2 is negative 6. Negative 6 times negative 6 is positive 36. And so this is something, this information, we're going to use to do the rest of our worksheet. So what term do we need to have to complete the square? And what we're going to do as we do this is we're going to force these things to factor as perfect square polynomials. And then that will allow us to solve using the square root method. And we're going to talk about that when I come back. Today we're just going to learn how to complete the square. So what do you need to complete the square? Well, remember, C is B over 2 squared. So in this example, B is 8. So I have 8 over 2 squared, which is 4 squared, which is 16. And so that's what I would put in that blank. Okay. That's the term that would be needed to complete the square. Alright, so now let's work that and put it into a couple problems. We have x squared plus 6x plus 8. Alright, so the first thing we do, and here's your steps right here on the left, hence, move the constant to the other side. So we're going to subtract 8 and subtract 8. So we're going to move the constant over to the other side. So you have x squared plus 6x equals 8. That's always your first step. Excuse me, negative 8. Now, I'm going to add a blank. So I have x squared plus 6x plus blank equals negative 8 plus blank. And I usually actually draw the blank in when I do the problem, and I'll show you that later. Then I fill the blank with what should be there. Alright, remember it's b over 2. This is your c term, and c is equal to b over 2 squared. Well, in this side, I always just put the b over 2. So that would be 6 over 2 squared. Okay. Now, there's no reason really to write 6 over 2. I'm going to write 3. So I'm going to erase the 6 over 2 because 6 divided by 2 is 3. So I'm just going to write 3 squared. On the right, though, I go ahead and square it. 3 times 3 is 9. The reason I leave it in that form on the left is because this number, identical, is what comes down into the factor. So my final factorization, this then factors, if you remember going back and up and looking at number 3 and 4, will factor as x plus 3, all of that squared. And that equals negative 8 plus 1, 9. Later we can use the square root method to solve this for x. But right now I just want you again just to learn how to complete the square. So let's go to our next example. 4x squared plus 8x minus 16 equals 0. Now in this case, there's a greatest common factor. You can take care of that first, or you can take care of that second. I would personally take care of it before I did anything else. Always factor out a greatest common factor. But if I do the instructions here, move the constant to the other side, so you have 4x squared plus 8x equals positive 16, because I have to add 16 to both sides. Okay. Now, divide by 4. Divide everything by 4, because remember, to complete the square, I don't want a number here. I want it to be 1. So whatever if there is in front of the x squared, that's what you have to divide by. So we're going to divide everything by 4. And that'll leave us with x squared plus 2x equals 4. Now we add the blank, because we have to put a c term in there. So we have x squared plus 2x equals 4. And we're going to put something in this blank. And whatever we do to one side, we have to do to the other side. So 2 divided by 2, remember, it's going to be 2 divided by 2 squared. Well, 2 over 2 is 1. So I'm just going to put a 1 there. And 1 squared is 1. 1 times 1 is 1. So that's what gets added to the other side. Now when I write the completion of the square as a factor, a factored polynomial, square root of x is x. This 1, square root of 1 is 1. And so 4 plus 1 on the right is 5. And so that would be your answer if I asked you to complete the square. Okay, let's look at the last 2 examples, 7 and 8. Okay, we're going to move the 7 over. So we have here x squared plus 8x equals negative 7. Now we're going to rewrite that with a blank. Okay, that we're going to fill in. And whatever we put in the blank on the left, we have to put in the blank on the right of the equal sign, because whatever we do to one side, we have to do to the other. So what goes in the blank? It's 8 divided by 2 squared. And 8 divided by 2 is the same as 4. So that's going to become 4 squared. 4 squared, 4 times 4 is 16, so it goes over here as 16. Now when I write the completing the square, you have one factor and it's squared. So that's x plus 4. Again, the x comes down and the 4 comes down just like they are, but the squaring is down the outside of the factor, or the parentheses, equals negative 7 plus 16 is 9. And then that's your final answer right there, if the instructions are to complete the square. Okay. Now, number 8. Again, you can factor out your greatest common factor first. You can factor it out last. It doesn't matter. I'm going to go ahead and factor it out. So I'm going to divide everything by 5. And that leaves me with x squared minus 4x plus 3 equals 0. Now let's take that and set it up to complete the square. Remember, this number is going to have to come to the right. It'll change signs and become a negative 3. And so we'll have x squared minus 4x plus blank equals negative 3 plus blank. Now we have to fill in the blanks. This is always, the blank is always b over 2 squared. So negative 4 over 2 is negative 2 squared. But negative 2 times negative 2 is positive 4. Now, again, we write this. It's x. Whatever's in your parentheses right here comes down. So it's x minus 2. And that equals negative 3 plus 4 is 1. And so that's your answer. You have completed the square. You have forced it, this polynomial that wouldn't factor perhaps, to factor as a perfect square by adding that constant on both sides.